Paul is Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, the community organizing umbrella of a 60-year-old congregational denomination of American Jewry. He also serves as lead staff for SHU's Pluralistic Social Justice Initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy, mobilizing Jewish voices to defend the separation of religion and government. Paul is a writer, speaker, advocate, and consultant on issues including secularity, intermarriage, disaffiliation, and inclusion. He co-authored 2 books, and his writing has appeared in The Forward, Jewish Week, Huffington Post, and elsewhere. He is the white Ashkenazi half of a Jupanese, that means Jewish and Japanese, multiracial household, and administers the Jupanese page on Facebook. So Mike, you're gonna help us put the chairs and the mics in the right place so we can have our interview. Okay, great. All right, does this work for you?
Sure.
Wait till you get settled.
Hi, everyone. My kids said that bio makes me sound smart, so at least there's that.
Children keep us humble, don't they?
Yeah.
I always say with kids, there's a certain time when they embarrass us, and then we get to the point when we can embarrass them. So I don't know if you're there where you are right now.
I've been embarrassing them from the get-go. I thought that's the whole plan.
Okay, great. Well, welcome. I'm delighted that you're here. I've known you for a while, and of course, you also know my daughter, who's with the American Humanist Association. So there's a lot of overlap here. Let's start off with sort of like fleshing out that bio a little bit and tell us, how you came to Humanistic Judaism and then how you came to lead it.
Wow, I'll try to be brief, but I will start kind of with my Jewish atheist origin story, which I've told before, but I haven't told it in front of my mom yet, and she's here, so she's in this, so it should be interesting. But I grew up in the conservative movement of American Judaism, which is the most horribly named of all the Jewish denominations, because most members of conservative Judaism are liberal Americans, but the name conservative Judaism was in response to Reform Judaism, because they felt that Reform Judaism went too far. So they wanted to conserve it. So they kind of fall somewhere between Orthodox Judaism, which you may be familiar with if you know anything very little about Judaism. Those are the folks who wear traditional black garb, and they are the most visible, but they're only 10% of American Jewry. So conservative Judaism is what I grew up with, and I knew from a very young age that I did not believe the words I was saying during prayer services. And I felt like I had nobody to talk to about that, because there wasn't that kind of open dialogue that I think does exist in certain Jewish communities with a rabbi who is willing to have those conversations. I didn't feel like that was open to me. And I felt like my bar mitzvah prep, the Jewish coming of age ceremony at age 13, was what I describe as memorizing a bad song in a language I don't understand. That was it's called a Haftorah portion. It's in Hebrew. I didn't understand Hebrew. You had to learn how to chant it in a certain trope. And I remember this moment. It was, I believe, right in front of my garage door. I don't get that specific usually when I tell it, but she's sitting right here. And I thought I was going to drop this bombshell by saying, I'm not having a bar mitzvah because I don't believe in God. I was 11 or 12, and she said, well, I don't believe either, and you're having a bar mitzvah. And I had a bar mitzvah. But it started me thinking, well then, why does she, my mom, dedicate her professional career to the Jewish people, which she had. She ran Jewish community centers her whole career very successfully. And I already kind of knew the answer, because her parents were Holocaust survivors, and she was born in a displaced persons camp in Berlin. And maintaining Jewish identity was extremely important. And as I started to recognize it, I realized I'm probably at least third generation atheist Jew, because my grandmother, when I look at photos of her, she used to have up a couple of photos of life before World War II, and her siblings. She had many siblings, all killed during the war. There was this photo that I remember vividly of them all gathered, and they were all wearing like black turtlenecks, like in the 30s. They were not observant Jews. They were Bundists, which was the Jewish labor movement in Eastern Europe, very secular and socialist. Jews have been secularizing since as soon as people were allowed to start secularizing. So this was unknown to me as I was growing up. And I thought, oh, well, everyone here must believe it because we're all saying these words. And I wish I had known about humanistic Judaism as an option when I was growing up. I didn't know about it, and that's part of what kind of fires my personal mission to let people know that there is an opportunity to continue doing Jewish without saying anything you don't believe and being authentic to what you do believe. So.
You have a quotation from Sherwin Wine, and I remember him well. When I was clergy leader at the Long Island Society, he came and one of the I guess it may have been 20th or 30th anniversary of the group out on Long Island. And I just liked him so much. And I said, Sherwin, one of these days I want to be able to speak extemporaneously the way you do. And it was such a tragic loss when he died so suddenly when he was on vacation. And,
yeah. So Sherwin Wine was the rabbi who founded Humanistic Judaism. So as I was saying, secular Judaism has been around for 150 years or more, and Jews were secularizers, and the history of ethical culture starts with Felix Adler. Is that him?
No, that's Dr. Henry Newman,
okay.
who was the leader here in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for asking.
Okay. So Felix Adler was a rabbi's son, right?
Yes.
And I don't want to tell your movement's origin story wrong, but my understanding is he was being groomed to take over the rabbinate.
Absolutely.
And one of his first sermons, if not the first sermon.
The future of Judaism.
Right. And it was about being atheist, right?
No,
Okay.
but close.
Okay.
Well, we'll talk later.
Okay. It wasn't a good fit for his congregation, right?
Yeah.
And he founded ethical. So there were secular Jews at the beginning of ethical culture. So that was always a stream of Judaism. But what Rabbi Sherwin Wine did, and he was ordained in the Reform movement, which is a theistic movement, he came out as openly atheist agnostic. And this was 1963, when it wasn't so easy to do that, and he was immediately labeled the atheist rabbi. It's not really the word he used. He embraced the philosophy of humanism, which I think folks here know, but I will give you my definition.
Please do.
Is the way I describe it is that we acknowledge or recognize that there will be no divine intervention, and therefore it is up to human beings to make the world a better place with using the best of human capacities and intelligence, science, emotions. I always include empathy, and that it's up to us. So what the innovation he did in the mid-60s was to rewrite Jewish liturgy and remove God and the supernatural, but overlay it with humanistic values. So our value system is not solely informed by Jewish tradition and Jewish texts and Jewish liturgy. Some of it is. We haven't completely discarded the wisdom of our ancestors, and that's why I chose those first two quotes from Jewish texts, ancient rabbis. But it's up to us to decide what is still relevant and what is no longer relevant. I never met Sherwin Wine. I feel his impact every day because the people I work with were so impacted by him. But I feel like there's a benefit to, there's a disadvantage to have never met this founder of our movement, but there's also a benefit that I don't feel like I'm trying to replicate what he was doing.
He would have liked you.
I hope so. I don't know.
So let's see. So you address some of the different varieties, if you will, of Judaism. And so if you sort of imagine like a spectrum, we can have on the one end, you mentioned Orthodox, but of course, even farther are the Hasidim, which here in Brooklyn, the Satmar and the Lubavitch and everything, and then of course we move over into more of a sort of the Reconstructionist, and so there is kind of this spectrum, isn't there?
Right.
Do you feel comfortable in that, and do you feel that, I guess here's a question that comes up for a lot of us, because you've probably seen we've got some lovely signage now on our new space, and so we're hoping that people will become interested, they'll come in, we'll have new members, but we still feel very awkward about proselytizing. So I'm wondering if that's awkward for you as well, and how do new members come into Humanistic Judaism?
That's a great question. I don't think of it as proselytizing. I'm not trying to deconvert anybody who takes great value in their religious beliefs. I'm trying to find my people. And I know statistically that a huge percentage of Jews were just like me. They don't believe what they're saying, and most of them who don't have walked away from organized Judaism. So we're trying to create a space for folks to still be a part of Jewish community, identity, and so on. So I call it raising awareness. And when we look at what's happening in America today, people have left religion. Like, we didn't do that. We didn't pull them out of religion. They are leaving organized religion, and they're unaware that there are other options for community, but there's a growing recognition that the lack of community is hurting people. There's a loneliness epidemic and so on. So we're looking to recreate what is beneficial in religious communities without, again, having to say things that we don't believe.
It's about community, isn't it? It's about feeling that you can authentically belong to a community.
Right.
And one of the things Felix Adler, as a young man, did in that his first and, as it turns out, his last sermon at Temple Emmanuel, was also to speak to kind of that authenticity. But also, and given the times at the end of the 19th century, where the social gospel was sort of afoot, was to say, we as Jews need to walk the talk of our values and be doing the good deeds and putting that. So, as you know, one of our aphorisms is putting deed above creed. Sure. So I'm wondering, in a similar fashion, does Humanistic Judaism look at deed above creed, or what is your stance with regard to social justice? Sure. And how does that play in your community? Well,
I think that it's a huge piece of it, but I don't think it's the only piece. So I want to answer yes and yes. What I found amazing about what Felix Adler did was, because another spectrum we can talk about is universal and particular. And he went all the way to universal. Yeah. He came from a Jewish traditional background and recognized that the values were of universal merit and people can benefit from it regardless of their background. Humanistic Judaism is a different approach, which is, I think we align on all of the values, but there is a recognition that the particular of Jewish identity is still of value for a lot of people. And one of the ways that I describe the value for me personally, but I think everyone gets to decide for themselves. I am a white man in America, heterosexual, and not considered at-risk minority, unless I were to put on a yarmulke and walk around and become visibly associated with a minority, which I don't do, but I know an atheist Jew who does, specifically for that purpose, to no longer have the privilege, the white privilege and the male privilege. To me, being part of a minority that has at times been at risk requires a recognition that there are many people who are in the minority and at risk. And so I think it increases empathy. So that's one of the many reasons why I still want to identify Jewishly rather than simply say, I'm a universalist, I'm a person, all people are equal, all of which I believe, but I want to hold on to that particularist piece of it because people in this country right now, over the last 3 weeks, have been attacked and killed for being Jewish, and I don't want to let go of that piece of my identity. There was a second part that I'm blanking on of what you asked about.
Okay. We'll circle around. So part of it is about identity. And part of what I heard you say before is about belief. And in a similar way, I recall sitting in the pews or kneeling, standing, kneeling, sitting, the sort of the choreography of growing up in a Roman Catholic church of thinking, I don't believe this. But my family was there, my community was there. Had I stayed in that small village, I would have had to stay there. Or maybe one of the other churches, but not going to a church would not be an option socially living in that area. So I think part of it also is about exposure, right? I mean, so like we're talking about raising awareness so people know about humanistic Judaism. We're talking about raising awareness so people who walk by know that we're here as well. How do you imagine, I don't know that either of us can answer this, reaching out to those folks who maybe are stuck someplace, are feeling that struggle and they're torn because they're kind of forced in order to make a living, in order to be in a community, to not be their authentic selves.
Yeah.
I imagine you've thought about that a lot.
I have. And I know that, so there are folks in my movement who can't understand why a Jewish person would continue to attend services when they don't believe it. But we are really serving a very small sliver of American Jews who don't want to say those words, can't bring themselves to say those words, versus many Jews who are fine saying those words even though they don't believe them, and I get it. These are the words that my ancestors said. Or this is the mourner's Kaddish, the blessing, the prayer that my parents would want me to say, even if I don't believe these words. These are the words they used and their parents used and so on. And who am I to break tradition? And that was one of the key criticisms that Sherwin-Wine got when he did it. In the 50s, things have changed. In the 50s, most of his colleagues coming out of Reform Seminary were humanistic Jews too. They agreed with him. They just didn't want him to blow the cover of the gig. It was a good gig, and they didn't like that he was now revealing openly that he didn't believe it. One of the things I often point to is the Pew Foundation does a survey of American Jewry once every 10 years or so. So the last one was 2020. And they asked a question in a way that I was so excited about because I hadn't seen this. I've seen variations of it, but I liked the way they asked it, which was, do you believe in the God of the Bible? And only 26% of US Jews said yes to that, compared to 54% of all Americans. That is a dramatic difference. They asked a follow-up question to those who said, no, I don't believe in the God of the Bible. Do you believe in any other higher power or spiritual force? To which 50% of US Jews said yes, leaving 24% of US Jews who are just flat out atheist agnostic. Again, that compares to 10% of all Americans. So a huge percent, almost a quarter of all US Jews are just flat out atheist agnostic. They did not ask a second follow-up question, which I wish they would have, to the 50% of US Jews who said that they believe in some other higher power or spiritual force, but not the God of the Bible. My question would have been, does that other higher power or spiritual force interject into human affairs? Does it answer prayers? Does it hear prayers? Because my guess is that half of that half would say no to that as well, meaning that the God that they're talking about is really just a rebranding of nature. The God of Spinoza, if you know that philosopher, right? So they don't want to let go of the word God, and the Reconstructionist movement it's very hard to nail them down on what they actually believe. And they're lovely people, and I get to be in coalition with them on the social justice angle. But they want to leave it open for people. And they have people in their movement who I think would say they do believe mostly. I don't think they have a ton of people who would say they believe in the God of the Bible, but the variation of what that other higher power spiritual force is pretty big. And so some of them may believe that prayer is being heard. Many of them, I think, believe that it is not, but they don't want to let go of that word God. Mm-hmm. And in Humanistic Judaism, we want to name things what they are. We feel like the rebranding of God, it doesn't work for us personally, and potentially has some danger because, and it's being used a lot today in politics, the word God has a very specific meaning to a lot of other Americans. And if we try to kind of fit ourselves into that, the way that God and religion is being weaponized, I think it just provides fuel for the folks who would use it to hurt us instead of us being open about what we believe. So that piece of belief and authenticity, which is, I appreciate that you use that word, is very important to us. But then the action, like what do we do with this? And so social justice is essential to our work. And I have cards if folks want to learn more about our social justice initiative, which is called Jews for a Secular Democracy. And this is actually, we set it up as a pluralistic initiative. So we felt that all Jews should recognize that separation of church and state in America has been incredibly important to the success of U.S. Jews and the inclusion of Jews in American society as full citizens. So issues of church-state separation that we look at are, for example, reproductive rights, right? Abortion is being attacked from a religious perspective that no Jews hold, and it's disheartening to see some ultra-Orthodox now kind of suggesting that abortion should be illegal. In Judaism, life never began at conception. The Talmud talks about life not even necessarily being considered fully human until the baby is out of the body and breathing, the first breath of life. So there have always been a different approach to when life begins in Judaism than in Christianity, and therefore making abortion illegal is actually religious discrimination against Jews. So that's one perspective, LGBTQ equality. And this is where humanistic values actually inform whether they want to use the word humanist or not, most Jews in America. So over 85% of US Jews believe abortion should be legal in some form or another. Over 80% of US Jews believe gay marriage should be legal. So on these issues, we have a lot of consensus in our movement. And so that's why we kind of created this initiative, and because there was no longer a loud voice in the Jewish community focused on separation of church and state from a Jewish perspective.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting, even though, you know, we try to emphasize ethical behavior as sort of distinguishing it somewhat from belief, or we say that your belief informs your behavior. And Felix Adler said that he spelled God with 2 O's, you know, emphasizing the goodness piece of it. You're speaking to a kind of our language is subtle, it's nuanced, it allows for questions. I remember one young man who was in our Ethics for Children's program, and he was ready to do his coming of age, but his parents were also Jewish, and he said, maybe I'll have a bar mitzvah. So he actually went up to Temple Beth Elohim for a little while, and he came back, and he said, it's not just because they made me learn Hebrew. He said, it's because when they asked questions, they knew the answers already. Here at Ethical Culture, everyone asked the questions, and we're all engaged in finding answers together. It was that engagement and that dynamic that spoke to him. That doesn't speak to everyone. And I think when you're talking about a definition of God, and I was a university chaplain, so we struggled with a lot of that on campus. And one of my colleagues, a Christian chaplain, had somebody come in, a student saying, I just want you to know I don't believe in God. And so my colleague said, describe the God that you don't believe in, and chances are I don't believe in that God either. So I think, you know, opening up that question, as you were talking about, what do you mean when you use that word? Exactly. How do you feel? What do you hear? What do you see? How do you behave when you think about, you know, that? Right. And sadly, and it's not just true of politics today, sadly, it's been true for a long time. Politics just doesn't make room for nuance and subtlety. And when it's being used as a weapon, then I think we all suffer from that.
Yeah. Well, and what you're saying also, language is really important, and defining the terms that we're using is also really important. And I do think that today, many more rabbis do have those conversations about, tell me about the God you don't believe in, or, you know, and the main difference between humanistic Judaism and like CBE, the Congregation Beth Elohim, which is the big Reform temple here in Park Slope, is the default, which is, you know, they have wonderful rabbis, and especially on social justice, Rabbi Rachel Timner is remarkable. And I think a lot of people are part of that community because of that, or because of their school, which is large. They actually have, it's a shul with a pool, right? They have a pool. And I think she would be pretty open in talking about what she does and doesn't believe about the universe. And then it's like, and now that we've had that conversation, please open to page 32 and we're going to pray to God. Versus in our movement, we're not enforcing what anybody does or doesn't believe, but our default is not to use the God language, but instead to use a liturgy that talks about human power to make change in the world. And so it's just about default. But I want to also define like the word atheist, because when I say atheist, what I mean is I don't believe in the God of the Bible or any other God as described by any other man-made religion. As far as other things that might exist in the universe, I'm agnostic because I don't think anybody can know. But I do think the way we're going to find out is through scientific exploration and not looking in the writings from our ancient elders from 2,000 years ago, which again is not to say they didn't have some really profound thoughts, because they did. And I want to hear it and I want to learn it. But now then we get to match that up against our lived experience and the increased knowledge that we have today compared to 1,000 years ago. You know, this initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy, one of the reasons we made it pluralistic was to make sure that secular Jews had a seat at the table, so that when we talk about abortion, for example, I can talk about what the Talmud has to say, and at the same time say, and that doesn't matter to me, because I don't care really what an ancient rabbi said when, first of all, it was a guy, they were all guys, right? You know, the whole system was, the society was dramatically different. I think it is a personal decision for the pregnant person and their family and medical provider, and that's it. You know, I want to stop with science and personal autonomy. So in this initiative, we bring multiple perspectives, and the lovely thing is about doing that is, therefore, government shouldn't be the one making that decision. And so, and that's also why I think I want us to be in interfaith coalitions, which I think is challenging, because I think many interfaith coalitions don't include secular people, and that's another thing that we are working toward on this and other initiatives, is to be in partnership with liberal religion, including Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist Judaism, because on all of these issues we're in alignment, and we need to help be a bridge between the growing number of secular Americans or non-religiously affiliated Americans and organized religions that are supportive of our ethics.
You referred a couple of times to humanistic Jewish liturgy. Describe for us what a gathering, what your gathering would be like.
Well, I'll give you. Should I make my kids do this? When we light the Hanukkah candles, for example, the traditional blessing is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. That's how many blessings in Hebrew start, right? Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, and that is just cut. And it's blessed is the light in the world, blessed is the light in humanity, blessed is the light in Hanukkah, right? So some folks in our movement don't even want us to say blessing, right? But I'm okay with that word. Again, want to kind of define it. But what are we thankful for? most Jews, when they're lighting that Hanukkah menorah, are not having a religious experience. Most Jews are having a cultural experience. And that is the other piece. I should get back to Sherwin Wine. He saw Judaism as a culture in which religion was one aspect. And another really important aspect are bagels. No, but there are dozens of other ways that Jews are Jews culturally, and the religion is one aspect of it. It informs a lot, but not all of the culture. And actually, it's a culture of cultures because there are multiple Jewish ethnicities, and all of it is interesting and valid. So we have the opportunity to kind of celebrate all of that. So when we're lighting those candles, even I would argue conservative and Reform Jews are not necessarily experiencing religion so much as a cultural identification. So that's kind of the tweak of the language, but the rituals, many of the rituals have remained as a way to tie us to meaning. To me, this is all about a search for meaning as well. Like, how do you let your values inform your actions? So the social justice component is very important, but also the on the hierarchy of needs. Once you're able to put a roof over your head and feed yourselves, you start to get to self-fulfillment, and this needs to provide meaning for people. And if we're going to go out there and try to engage new people, we have to be leading with this will bring meaning and value to your life in addition to what you've already got going on. Community is part of that meaning and value, but we're a pretty heady group of people in our movement, and so if it's just reading books on your own and then maybe talking about it, that's okay too, right? It can be personal meaning. It doesn't always have to be in community, but that's a big piece of it as well.
Since you have introduced your family, I don't know does he have a deal with you that he pays you when he mentions your name? My children, I have to give them $1 every time I mention their names. Anyway, comparing families. So you have a mixed family. I do. My husband, I have to pay him now. My husband, Glenn, was raised Jewish. I was raised Catholic. Our children were raised here in Brooklyn Ethical. And so you have found a way with your children to raise them in your own way. How does that work? And maybe your family would be interested in sharing if they're comfortable. But our families, we mix, we get to know each other, we leave home, we go to college, we travel, we meet each other, and we fall in love and form families that our parents and grandparents never imagined.
Mm-hmm. This is before I started at Society for Humanistic Judaism. I spent 16 years working for an organization that focused specifically on helping the Jewish community address intermarriage between people who are Jewish and not Jewish. Because traditionally, it was frowned upon. I don't know if any of you have seen or heard of the play and movie Fiddler on the Roof. Spoiler alert. At the end, he cuts off the daughter that intermarries, right? And that was the lesson. So, and I hope I didn't ruin it for you, but it's 50 years old, so I'm sorry. Throughout the play and movie, he only has daughters. That's his curse, and right, because you have to pay for all of the weddings, and he was poor, and each daughter kind of transgresses what he wants for them, and each time he does a little spiel about on the one hand, on the other hand, and then with the intermarriage though, there was no other hand. And what was so remarkable was when this play came out in the late 60s. Intermarriage among Jews and non-Jews was already beginning to skyrocket. They didn't have numbers yet, but there was a sense that this was a big deal. And before the late 60s, only about 5% of US Jews married someone who wasn't Jewish. And this was primarily because it wasn't just the Jewish community that didn't want intermarriage. It was the vast majority of Americans who would have been very disappointed if their children married someone who was Jewish. As anti-Semitism began to recede in America, and Jews were, started to be seen as just another ethnicity, it became less of a tragedy for the non-Jewish side to have a Jew marry into their family. And intermarriage skyrocketed, and the Jewish community, organized Jewish community, really had a difficult time. So when I was growing up, again, not to put everything on this poor conservative synagogue that was my, got me into this, but it felt like the sermon every other week was don't intermarry. Yeah. I heard it over and over again. And at the same time, I was going to public school. I knew lots of girls who were not Jewish, who I liked, and some Jewish girls who I didn't like, and I was getting this value system from the same community and parents that were saying don't intermarry, to see everybody as a unique individual and not judge people based on the color of their skin or their religious background, except when it comes to marriage and like the record scratching noise of like, no, don't. And I will tell you, I mentioned my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and my grandmother told me literally, if you marry someone who's not Jewish, you finish Hitler's job. And coming from somebody who was a Holocaust survivor, that, was very powerful. And I knew from a very young age, again, that you're wrong. I felt it was just hypocritical to say all people are equal and only marry from this group of people. And half of American Jews or more also felt that way and have married somebody who's not Jewish. And a couple of things have happened since then. The Jewish community has finally kind of gotten better at welcoming, and the intermarried households are raising Jews at replacement levels. So what was the concern? The concern was if Jews marry someone who's not Jewish, their children won't be Jewish. And that hasn't happened. Now, if you talk to Orthodox people, they will say, well, what kind of Jews are they? Like, there's always going to be a line that they will continue to move that we're not meeting. But there are more Jews in America today than at any time in US history, according to the Pew survey. And that's because intermarried families are raising their kids with a Jewish identity. But it's not a religious identity. So that's the piece that we want to help people serve, which is, how do we see Judaism as a culture? So when you talk about my own family, there's no clash, because with culture, the more you do, the better. With religion, especially Judaism and Christianity, there's a pretty clear line there, and his name is Jesus. And if you believe in Jesus, your family is on one side, and if not, and like there was, or like the Christmas tree, which the Jewish community saw as this incredible threat, even though many Jews put up Christmas trees at a certain time in American history when no one in that household was Christian. So when it's just a culture and it's not a religion, there is no conflict. I go to visit family in Japan, and I go to Japanese temples, and I am not practicing religion in Japanese temples as much as I'm not practicing religion when I go back to that conservative synagogue. I'm not religious. So it is just a cultural expression when I go to a Japanese temple and we clap twice to wake the gods. Am I getting this right? And then you throw coins in the coin box. And it's a ritual. And one of the things I actually love about Japan, which is overwhelmingly secular as a society, is that you cannot pull out the religious ritual from the culture. And it's the same thing with Judaism. You cannot pull out the cultural expression of lighting a Hanukkah menorah from the religious piece of it. We changed the words, was one way that we're trying to address that. But it comes from the religion, and that piece is always going to be there. And it's just about how do we recognize it, celebrate it, and then be able to incorporate other things. And should my kids grow up to marry or partner with somebody of Italian and Guatemalan descent, then their children, should they have them, will have 4 cultures to choose from, or pick any other one that you're interested in. People get to pick and choose. Some people are choosing Dungeons and Dragons as their primary culture, and that is fine. That this is about meaning making. Judaism is also an ethnicity, or really a collection of a couple of different ethnicities, and that ethnic identity is very strong and ethno-nationalist, in some way, identity, is very strong for a lot of Jews. But it's going away, and I think it's gone away in my family in a lot of ways because it's not the ethnic connection that is going to sustain Judaism, I don't believe. We were upstate New York. My stepdad and I were walking in Smyrna, I think, New York, little tiny town. Literally nobody around in this park except one guy and his dog. And my stepdad looks at him and he goes, "Landsman?" Which is, Yiddish for what? Fellow Jew, right? And of course, why is it that he was able to recognize a Jew just by looking at them? Is this ethnic component, which I still am both appreciative of and deeply discomforted by. And I have Judar, and and that's going away. And so is common Jewish last names is going away through intermarriage and so on. And some people feel a sadness that that's going away. And I get that, but I'm interested in what comes next and how do we sustain meaning through Jewish identity for folks who may only be 1/16 Jewish by blood or not Jewish by blood at all, but want to take on the meaning and connection to it. We didn't even talk about history. I'm a huge history buff, and I find the history fascinating, and that may be an entry point for people. But, people denigrate Bagel and Locke's Jews as not deeply Jewish, not really Jewish. But I find that absurd because bagels are awesome. So it's, it is what you find meaning in, and I don't want to get into judging who's real. That is such an awful slippery slope.
Great. I'm going to wind up this part of it on the meaning making and the community building. Okay. And we're on board with that. Meaning making and with empathy, community building.